First, I'll take you through some of the practical limits of economic theory that is sometimes used in natural resource management. Then I want to talk about the work of Elinor Ostrom, who's the first and so far the only woman to get the Nobel Prize in economics. She spent a large part of her career looking at how resource users can successfully manage their own natural resources. Then I want to do something which may seem odd, which is compare Canterbury with California, but hopefully it'll make sense when we get there. Then I want to talk about what this all might imply for water management in New Zealand. Much of what I'm going to say is in Elinor Ostrom's 1990 book, it's called Governing the Commons. Ostrom has researched, what she did was research institutions that manage natural resources, and she looked at failures and successes. So I'm being utterly upfront here and saying this isn't a panacea, okay? I should remember my slides, shouldn't I? How am I working this? Oh, here we go, roller works. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about at collective governance or collaborative governance isn't a panacea, so I'm not presenting you with this solution, okay? And I am, as Alistair said, I'm an employee of the Electricity Authority, but they're really happy for me to come along and talk to you, but nothing I say is anything to do with the authority at all, or its role. Economics and research, resource use. So the tragedy of the commons is a story, I guess, used to describe failures in natural resource use. It's really about how resource users, when acting in their own best interests or own self-interest, exhaust the resource. So their own best interest leads to a socially inefficient outcome. The standard policy response to this is either regulation or some sort of trading regime. But it's worth looking at the underlying theory that leads to those policy prescriptions. And I'll try and explain this from using a story from economics called the Prisoner's Dilemma. So the Prisoner's Dilemma is a story about two prisoners that are captured and held separately, and they're each offered the same deal. They can betray or rat on their friend and go free. If they're ratted on, then they get 10 months in prison. If they rat on each other, they get 8 months in prison. If neither of them rat, they get 4 months in prison each. So under certain assumptions, it's logical for these prisoners to rat on each other and get 4 months each. So you can imagine this story applied to resource users or natural resource users. They act in their own best interest, they rat on each other, and they end up with a socially inefficient outcome. So at the risk of confusing everyone, the pig in the trough ratted on the pig outside the trough. So, and that's yeah. If you Google socially inefficient outcome, you don't get very many interesting pictures. So I showed it to my wife last night, and she said, "You can't put a pig's bum in the presentation." So it's worth looking at these conditions that lead to the prisoners to rat on each other. So they're coerced into not communicating. They do not have access to a legal system, which they can use to enforce binding agreements. They cannot change the rules of the game themselves. They do not share any useful social norms like trust. So there's also no time in the story. So the story doesn't take into account the number of times they've been put in prison together and have tried to and played the same game. So this story, or this theory, prisoner's dilemma comes from a set of economic theory that is really if-then. So if a certain set of conditions are in place, then this outcome will happen, this socially inefficient outcome will happen, and the pig jumps in the trough, right? So it's not a general theory. It's not a theory that says in any circumstances put two prisoners together and you'll get this socially inefficient outcome. So extend that to natural resources and you get the conclusion that it's not inevitable that there's a tragedy of the commons, okay? The other thing I want to point out about this theory is it doesn't really perform well when it's played in labs. Some economists are lucky enough to have the job where they play these sorts of games like prisoner's dilemmas in labs. So they sit around and watch, and students come in and play the games. They get actual payoffs, and the economists collect data, and that's their research, if you can believe it. So the experimental evidence is that the prisoner's dilemma doesn't always happen, and it's quite vulnerable to changing the specific assumptions you make about it, particularly the payoffs and also pre-game communication. So if your prisoners have a little chat in the van on the way to the police station, you may not get the same dilemma. Likewise, if your resource users can talk to each other and come to a view on how they want to manage their own resources, the tragedy of the commons won't necessarily result. And I'll talk more about counterexamples in a second. But theory like the prisoner's dilemma leads to a really black and white view of the world. It sort of automatically funnels you into this world where you think, how do we set up a private property regime, or how do we do regulation? It doesn't help you step back and think about whether or not you need private property regimes or regulation. It ignores things like government failure, $140,000 TV screens, for example. Market failure, ignores the experimental evidence and these counterexamples. So it's these counterexamples that I want to talk about now, and this is the core of Ostrom's work. So what she did through much of her career was she studied these self-organised institutions and really importantly looked at both the successes and the failures. So again, I'm not claiming that these things always work, but they sometimes can work in a really durable way. So she studied the successes and the failures and looked at the differences between the successes and failures, found what was present in the successes and missing from the failures, and came up with 8 recurring factors or preconditions that are associated with success. And I'm going to go through those 8 preconditions or success factors now. And as I do this, please remember this is what Elinor Ostrom found in practice. It's not, she did some maths and came up with a theory and came up with 8 conditions. This is empirical evidence, right? This is what she's found. And there's a quote there, I think, that embodies Ostrom's approach. So a resource arrangement that works in practice can also work in theory. So, which I thought was quite witty. As I go through these preconditions, I want to try and sketch out for you how each of them could undermine the fundamental assumptions in the prisoner's dilemma that lead to the prisoners ratting out on each other and a socially suboptimal outcome and the pig in the trough, right? So the first condition is clearly define boundaries around the group and the resource. So who can withdraw, or who's in and who's out. So this is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it distinguishes these common pool resources, or these resources that you can build a fence around, from a open access resource like a deep sea fishery. Relating this to the prisoner's dilemma, you can imagine that making any sort of deal in the van on the way to the prison is really difficult for the prisoners if they don't know who's going to be offered that deal. They don't know who's who they need to not rat for them to get the socially optimal outcome, okay? So as soon as you define these clear group boundaries, you make solving the prisoner's dilemma easier in a socially optimal way. Match the rules governing the use of common goods to local needs and conditions. Really, I think this is about the subtitle of my presentation, which is how diverse institutions can work in New Zealand. So I don't know two catchments that are similar in New Zealand. So what this really means is that the rules should match exactly what's happening on the ground, whether that's biophysical conditions, the social norms, the local technology. So really leaving space for the users of the resource to innovate within their local constraints. Ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules. So this is really a vision of resource users managing themselves. So creating their own rules that are sustainable and lead to that optimal solution in the prisoner's dilemma. You can imagine, again, if the prisoners could change the rules of the game they're faced with, then solving the dilemma for themselves would be far easier. Now, whether that's changing the rules means they can communicate and make an enforceable deal before police talk to them and offer them their deal, or whether it means changing the payoff so the incentives to rat on each other are less. That again would make the prisoner's dilemma easy to solve in a more socially optimal way. Make sure the rule-making rights of the community members are respected by outside authorities. So this is really giving the users dominion over their own resource. And in the context of the prisoner's dilemma, that means if they do change the rules, that the police let them do that. Now, our monitoring, what Ostrom found is that really successful systems are monitored by the users themselves, or the monitors are accountable to the users. And again, with the prisoners, if the monitors of their deal, their deal that they make in the police van on the way to the jail, if they were accountable to the prisoners, that makes the prisoner's dilemma easier to solve. Graduated sanctions. So really, this is more to do with, I guess, how groups can be fragile as well as strong. If someone steps out of line, it's actually like being a parent. Someone steps out of line, you don't want to hit them hard initially. That might undermine the whole group, the whole cooperation. Same with children. You don't want to. And I'm guilty. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So, it's about gradually easing up those sanctions until there's some learning, right, and some change in behaviour. The group can be really strong if it's, I think, if that sort of discipline or is initially gentle, right. The other metaphor I tried to work with was you go out to dinner with a group of people and someone always orders the lobster, right? Twice as expensive as everything else. So the first time they do it, you might needle them gently, and then the second time you might needle them a bit less gently, and the third time you just won't invite them, right? So, so it's that sort of graduated sanction that sort of works well in a group, and that's what Ostrom found worked well with these collective choice institutions, or these collaborative governance institutions. 7, provide a low-cost means of dispute resolution. Which is really self-explanatory. Again, the prisoners, if they had access to this and there was some dispute about who ratted and who didn't rat, they'd be able to resolve that dispute cheaply. Build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest to the biggest. So, if you and one other person wants to choose a movie to go to, That's easier than 3 of you, which is easier than 4 of you. It's easier than 5 of you, right? So what this is about is that it's easier to make smaller deals, right? And then join them together than it is to try and make a huge deal initially. So again, with the prisoners, it might be easier to have a binding agreement between 2 prisoners, more and more difficult to have them, to make that initial binding agreement between more prisoners. But if you build it up slowly, it seems to be easier. So that's the conditions that Ostrom found and how they relate to the prisoner's dilemma, and how they make their prisoner's dilemma, I think, easier to solve. Elinor Ostrom also did some work on rights. So the rights in these collective or collaborative governance institutions, they derive from the collaboration. Okay, so the collaboration, needs to lead to some internally consistent set of rights for the people involved in the collaboration. If you think about natural resources, it's generally a dynamic environment. So whether it's climate change or some other reason, that the environment isn't static. So the collaboration or the collaborative governance regime will be dynamic, and hence the rights will be dynamic. What Ostrom's come up with is, and with a colleague, I think it's pronounced Schlager, came up with an organising framework for rights. You'll see as I go through this is a cumulative framework, so you can't have the second tier of rights unless you've got the first tier, and so on. And again, I think it's more of a organising framework for rights rather than a list of rights that you could divvy up in any particular circumstance. So the first one is an access right, so the right to access the resource for any use not involving its consumption. So I would imagine this would be something like recreational use when it comes to water. If you have an access right, then you may be able to have a withdrawal right. But if you can't have a withdrawal right without an access right, that's what I mean when I say it's cumulative. And a management right, I've missed C there, haven't I? I have to. Management right, so it's a right to determine how, when and where to withdraw. A withdrawal may take place, so you imagine it's a management right of those who are withdrawing. Again, it's cumulative. You can't have a management right unless you've got a withdrawal or access right. An exclusion right, so the right to determine who's in and who's out, so that first Ostrom condition, and then finally a transfer right. So, yeah, these aren't, I think, yeah, this is more an organising framework, I think, for specific rights that you may have associated with water, not really the list of rights, but maybe the list of types of rights. So I want to now compare California and Canterbury, if I can. So, and I want to look at these just quickly, these two areas as cases. So it might seem odd to look at California right now because it's in the midst of a worst drought in 1,200 years, I think. But I want to talk about the formation of the institutions that manage water in California that happened after the Second World War. The Californian example is what started Ostrom's research. It's what I'm going to talk to you about came from her PhD dissertation from, I think, 1962 or 4. And at that time, California had these 8 preconditions, so it's really an archetype of what Elinor Ostrom was talking about. Canterbury is interesting, I think, because it's an attempt to sort of shoehorn this sort of arrangement into the RMA. So, and I want to compare Canterbury and California then, and try and understand what these two areas mean for New Zealand, what a collaborative governance regime might look like for New Zealand. So California, so this story starts in the 30s when aquifers or basins, they call them there, were overused. And initially it was a tragedy of the commons. It was pigs in a trough. It was a race to use the resources. Around, it's quite a complex setting, so 10 oil companies, 20 industrial users, 250 small users including agriculture, 7 cities and 21 private water companies. So all extractive but quite varying. And so how the governance evolved is that in 1945 a sort of subset of users of one basin got together and used the court and the local authority, or the local government, I think, to set limits and define how use should be reduced to that limit. So and so eventually they got to a situation where they could tax, so they had the right from the local government to do sales tax in the area. They could they used the tax to fund injection wells along the coast to protect the aquifer from saltwater intrusion. They used the money also to purchase water from a viaduct that was coming in from Colorado to both replenish the aquifer and to replace the water replace the use of the water from the aquifer. So it was quite a, like I say, it worked well in terms of Ostrom's preconditions, because there was a set of well-defined users. In California at the time, they seemed to have the right to self-organise, right? So they could go to the court and get a judgment about resource use. There was no legislation that was stopping them doing that. They could go to the local government and take an act there to give them the power to tax, so their right to self-organise was respected. They made rules that suited their local needs, and they built up governance from a small half a basin to a set of interconnected basins. They controlled their own monitoring, and their courts provided a dispute resolution mechanism. So now Canterbury, I think, is really fascinating as well. So you guys probably know quite a lot about Canterbury, I imagine, but I see it as trying to implement collaborative governance, but within the confines of the RMA. So the zone committees were appointed. They were asked to seek consensus. They had a overarching water management strategy that gave them limits, and the local government, or ECAN, the regional authority, I guess, committed to implement the consensus through the RMA. The RMA hearing committees can change the recommendations, but my understanding is that so far they've mostly stuck to the spirit of what the zone committees have done. So without being critical, because I think it's a really interesting experiment, I guess, but you can see at least 3 of Alan Ostrom's conditions are missing there. So it wasn't really users participating in their own governance. It was appointed people doing governance on behalf of the users, even though I think the idea was that anyone can look into that zone committee and see someone around the table that has their views. the rulemaking rights aren't really respected by higher authorities, so the hearing committees can change what the zone committees come up with. And it was not nested in the way Ostrom envisaged, I guess, because it was mountains to the sea, so the whole catchment at once rather than allowing smaller groups to build up to a collaborative governance for the whole catchment. So Canterbury and California, I think they had some things in common and some quite different. So they both had quantity and quality issues. They both worked within existing structures. There was, in both cases, a tolerance for diverse local solutions, and there was complex and competing uses in both cases, although I think in California, although there were a diverse range of users, they were all extractive users, right? Whereas in, I think, New Zealand rivers, you might have much more recreational, you have hydro, and as well as extractive. There are differences too, I guess, that the democracy of it all. So the zone committees were appointed, they were not elected, and they weren't, I guess, in Ostrom's terms, the users themselves. The self-determination is what I mentioned before. The RMA hearing committees can change what the zone committees come up with, so the zone committees don't have that same self-determination. And like I said, the unit of organisation was different. So in California, they could build up to a larger institution from a small one, whereas these zone committees were tied to doing the entire catchment. So just speculating now, if you were going to try and implement something like this in New Zealand, right? What I've really done here is just taken what has happened in Canterbury, I guess, and add in maybe those 3 Ostrom conditions that are clearly missing. So instead of the zone committees, you'd have users themselves with the power to make rules about their resource. This right would be respected from the outside, and there would be flexibility about how they if they want to start small, they can start small, okay, and build up. So build their institutions in a nested way. There'd be, I guess, scope and flexibility to solve problems locally. So I think Canterbury have this, right? So the fact that they let the users figure out how and over what period of time they're going to hit limits, I think is a good thing. But there's some things that I think are a bit of anathema to policy making that will have to change. So things that will need to change because currently they're a bit of an anathema. So we don't do trial and error very well in policy making here. So I think if these institutions or if users are allowed to manage their own resource, there will be failures, right? And I think the trick then will be to distinguish between a failure that's terminal and a failure that is really just valuable learning. And the last thing I think is there's probably need a default regime for places where it just doesn't make sense to do collaborative governance, either because there's no scarcity, because transaction costs are high, the necessary social capital isn't there, or they've tried and failed, perhaps. So just getting back to what I was telling you at the beginning, I don't think these collaborative governance regimes are a panacea. In tragedy of the commons, they do happen. But I think there's enough in the empirical evidence of Elinor Ostrom to make it worth it. Make it worth considering collaborative governance as an option, right? So what I've tried to do is sketch out the limits to economic theory as it's applied to natural resources and show how Ostrom's work both makes the prisoner's dilemma easier to solve and also give you an idea of her work on the counterexamples where people have managed to solve their own resource issues. And I really want to challenge that notion that regulation and private property rights are the only tools at your disposal to manage water in New Zealand. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much.